caretakers of this land. Our topic today is transforming collections, connecting with communities. We are living in a time of overdue public questioning of the white supremacist and colonialist aspects of museums. It is necessary to consider how racism, sexism, classism, xenophobia, among other ills, have shaped museums' histories, collections, structures, and ongoing practices. Museums have played a vital role in the maintenance and glorification of white supremacy and colonialism in both material and symbolic ways. That is, they have been and are storehouses of stolen goods and sites where the logics and feelings of white supremacy are reproduced on social and individual levels. It is not enough to return selected prized objects to their homelands. We have to question and change the practices and positions of these institutions in their communities in real time. For instance, we must, as people, object to and grieve the current wave of anti-Asian violence that has resulted in vicious attacks and most recently claimed the lives of 8 people in Atlanta, most of whom were Asian women and sex workers. However belatedly, we must also ask, how have museums contributed to the objectification of Asian women through cultural violence rooted in persistent 19th century Orientalism and the histories of anti-Asian policies and exclusion? Take, for example, the 2015 controversy at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts about public programs called Kimono Wednesdays and Claude Monet flirting with the exotic. In both of these events, the institution promoted the kind of Orientalist fetishization, as was evident in Monet's 1876 painting, La Japonaise, by inviting viewers to objectify Asian culture and people on explicitly sexual and sexist terms. What could art institutions be like if they considered the workers of the Gold Spa as at the heart of the community that they serve? How does centering these communities change how we can see and interpret collections? We are indeed at a turning point in the museum world, where long-standing calls to decolonize the museum are now being taken seriously by the institutions themselves. Our plan today is to hear from 2 remarkable arts workers about 2 projects that can help us see the alternatives and possibilities for how museum collections and communities can come together. I will then moderate a discussion before we open it up to a Q&A. I invite you all to put your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom at any time. And the chat feature is also there as a way to make comments or share resources. But please do put the questions in the Q&A so I can make sure to try to get to them. Our first speaker today is Gamynne Guillotte. Gamynne is responsible for interpretation, public programs, education, and public engagement at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She has been the BMA's Chief Education Officer since 2018 and previously served as Director of Interpretation and Public Engagement and Manager of Interpretation. Previously, she was a designer at Los Angeles-based Narduli Studios, an interdisciplinary design firm with commissions in public art and architecture, and developed public programs at the MAK Center for Art and Architecture. Guillotte currently serves on the affiliates board for the Program in Museums and Society at Johns Hopkins University, the Membership and Programs Committee of the Association of Art Museum Interpretation, and is a project contributor to the Museums as a Site for Social Action initiative. Guillotte holds an MArch from the Southern California Institute of Architecture and a BA with concentrations in art history and architectural history from Sarah Lawrence College. Thank you, Gamynne, for joining us. Following Gamynne's presentation is Dana Bishop-Root. Dana Bishop-Root lives in gratitude, is guided by relationships, listening deeply, and expansive possibilities with an ever-present commitment to justice. Dana is a Director of Education and Public Programs at the Carnegie Museum of Art. Previously, she was the Associate Director at the Braddock Carnegie Library, where she continues to be an active participant. Dana serves on the boards of Common Field, Associated Artists of Pittsburgh, the Wellness Collection, and the Opportunity Fund. She's a founding member of General Sisters and Transformasium, with whom she's exhibited at Tufts Art Gallery, Boston, John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, the Jewish Museum in New York, the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, Konsthal C in Stockholm, the Japanese American Museum in San Jose, Williams College Museum of Art in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and the Mattress Factory and Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. Thank you, Dana, for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Gamynne.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me today. I wanted to first start by, of course, thanking Sylvia and Rebecca and Mary Carmen for organizing this really incredible discussion, and very excited to be in conversation with Dana a little bit later on. So I'm going to take us through a framing project as a way of thinking about what we're doing right now at the Baltimore Museum of Art and our practice. So as was said, I oversee education programs, public engagement really broadly conceived at the BMA. I'll be taking us through a satellite museum project. So the BMA Outpost project began as a temporary museum site in 2014. Next slide. And so it began as we were thinking about education broadly conceived, having a different kind of space and role in the museum. And this project began with this wonderful lady that you see here on your left, Katie Bachler, who was an independent curator and arts worker who was helping us think through the idea of home in Baltimore. We were working on a 3-year exhibition called Imagining Home, and wanted to start to look at a different kind of public engagement effort around that particular project. And the BMA Outpost came out of that. The BMA Outpost was a very small mobile museum, as you see here, that did first 1 month long residencies, and later 3-month-long residencies in neighborhoods throughout Baltimore. And it ran with an ethos of serendipity, radical social leveling, and the idea of reciprocity and exchange. So in each of these communities, there would be art making that would happen. There would be reproductions from the BMA's collection, which you're seeing here a little bit on the right. They would exist in the same kind of plane of space, and there would be conversation and discussion. In each of these instances, Katie would ask participants to tell them something about their neighborhood that mattered to them, and that would then become part of a community asset mapping process that would develop over time. And those maps would travel with the outpost from one site to the other. In its 5-year span, it was in places as diverse as libraries, where you'd expect to see something like this, farmers markets, but also the meat department of your local supermarket, IKEA. We looked at meeting people where they were and looking at both neighborhoods and crossroads. Next slide, please. So, in thinking about the outpost, one of the big questions that came to us is this idea that I'm going to throw out as a provocation for the group and for later discussion, is what constitutes the collection? What do we think of as worthy to collect within museum spaces? And what kind of knowledge is generated by our visitors, and what do we do with that knowledge, where it is generated? You're looking at the BMA Outpost here when it was at a public market. And the project that you're seeing was a spontaneous wall of life advice. It just started to happen. One visitor put up something in one of their artwork responses that was a bit of advice, and it seemed to be something that that particular community really needed. So another feature of all of the these kinds of engagements that we do is this notion of meeting people where they are and being accessible, flexible, and adaptable in how we build out these programs. So in other places, this wall would be covered with artwork. In this particular instance, it was really about life advice. And so what do we do with these kinds of spontaneous collections when they come into our care? It's something that we've been thinking very deeply about. So one of the things that we've learned from this work with the BMA Outpost over this 5-year period is every place we went, what we heard from our visitors was, we would like you to stay longer and go deeper in community. A month didn't feel long enough, so we extended it to 3 months. 3 months didn't feel long enough. And so we really started to think about, do we need to have a satellite museum space that is a permanent space? And if so, where might that be within the city of Baltimore? As many of you may know, and it's not entirely dissimilar from Pittsburgh, Baltimore is a majority-minority city. Baltimore is the city that is actually the home of redlining. Redlining as we know it and understand it was developed within the city of Baltimore. And it is a city that is still profoundly physically segregated by the way that the city itself is laid out. And so while you have wonderful opportunities to connect with community and very specific communities and neighborhoods, finding a place in the city where everyone goes and where everyone feels comfortable going is a very different and interesting kind of challenge. Next slide, please. So BMA Lexington Market. Next, please. So we focused on one particular site that had been a site for the Outpost that was enormously successful for us as a site. It's actually the image that you were just previously looking at was taken at Lexington Market. So Lexington Market is the country's oldest continuously operating public market. It dates from 1782, and it is what I would call an unreconstructed public market. This is not a Pike's Place public market. It is scrappy. It still serves its immediate community for day-to-day groceries. It is in a part of the city that is largely a food desert. And so while it has tremendous tourist draw for some of its fabulous delicacies, world famous Fabi's crab cakes, very exciting. While we see people come through the market when they're going to ball games, it's still a tourist site. It is still very much a site that is by and for community. And it's one of the very few places in the city that acts as a crossroads. And so we said we'd be very excited about thinking about Lexington Market as a place where we might put down stakes. And the Baltimore City Public Markets was really wonderful about agreeing to partner with us on this. So what does a museum look like within the context of a public market? Next slide, please. So we were fortunate enough to get a space. We looked all over the market, and after looking at and rejecting a number of spaces, we said, we just want a vendor stall. Just give us the same kind of stall that any other vendor would have at the market. And so we have a wonderful little 300 square foot space with a counter, as you see there. It is a place of art making. It is a place that also contains archives. We archive the art making that happens there in a form in zines, which is what you're seeing behind you to the left. And up front, you are seeing the absolute heart and soul of the project. So my co-conspirators on this, Dave Issa, who is my manager of community engagement, and Malika Clements, who is the community engagement coordinator. This project would not be possible without them. And we can talk a little bit more about this when we get into the Q&A and the back and forth conversation. But doing work like this is absolutely essential with the right people in place. And it cannot be reduced to a formula, and it cannot be fully institutionalized. The project when Katie Bachler took it over was a very, very different project than the project that Dave Issa has founded and shepherded. And it's really important that as we give these kinds of spaces the room to grow and with our audiences, for us as arts workers and arts professionals to understand what it is to be in community and to be able to bring our whole selves to that work is also a hugely important part of the work. Next slide. So one of our big questions that I also want us to reflect on as we think about the collection is who has expertise and what kind of expertise is valued and is understood to be valuable in the museum space. So we talk a lot in Lexington Market about radical hospitality, right? But what does it look like to make a space where everyone, truly everyone, is welcome, both as a participant and as an audience member, and where the line between participant, audience member, institution, and community starts to blur and becomes very fungible. So on the left, you're seeing, for instance, a food-based performance art work by the artist Crystal Mack, who's really interesting work around food justice in Baltimore. And on the right, you're seeing a regular day at the market. with children making art. Next slide, please. One of my favorite examples. So on the left, you are seeing a screening of that most recent short film by Solange Knowles. We were contacted by Solange's people and we're very fortunate to be one of the museums that was chosen to screen the new film. And we gave her a choice of a couple of venues for screening. We have a lovely, 360-seat screening facility at our main campus. We said, we also have this little kind of funky space down at Lexington Market. What do you think about that? And very fortunately, she very graciously was very excited about Lexington Market as a space to screen. It brought up wonderful logistical challenges that were fun to solve. But we held this as a public screening within a space that I think of all of the institutions that screened it, we were the only one who screened it off site. On the right, you're seeing a workshop about how residents can access SNAP benefits, because the rules around SNAP were changing at the time, and a lot of market vendors and a lot of market clients were very concerned about how they would be able to use their benefits in the market space. So the idea that these kinds of things, sort of high art and advanced culture and meeting community need, exist within the same space, within the same site, and that all kinds of expertise is welcome is extremely important. Next slide, please. What does a museum look like? I think is the question I'm going to leave you with in this talk. And these are a number of our collaborators. These are the kinds of folks who we work with when we're working through programs, workshops, lectures, events, and performances within the BMA Lexington Market space. And so we may have a talk with our colleagues at Baltimore Museum of Industry. We may have the folks from Connie's Chicken and Waffles to come in and talk about their foodways as an artistic practice, and any number of individual citizens, thinkers, makers, and doers who did not get the fancy logo to put on this board as well. Last slide, please. And I'll leave us with this thought. Sorry, second to last slide, please. And I'll leave us with this thought here. What you're seeing on the left, of course, is the Baltimore Museum of Art, which has both the benefits and the problems of the classical museum space. We're demi-encyclopedic. We are quite literally a temple on a hill, on a plinth. And what you're seeing on the right is a community dinner in the main arcade at BMA Lexington Market. So how do we make the space on the left function a little bit more like the space on the right? Is something that we're thinking very deeply through. Last slide. Thank you very much. I'm excited to talk more about this.
Thank you so much. It's a really exciting project, and I'm looking forward to talking more about it. Now we'll turn to Dana Bishop-Ruth.
Hey, hi everyone. Great. Gamynne, thank you. It was incredible to listen to you, because already the links and the kind of connected tissue of questioning and what these projects are in relationship to each other made me think a lot about kind of the form and what the form of these spaces are and how we work to alter the contents within them. So also I'm very honored to be here. Thank you so much to Becca and to Sylvia and Mari Kamran for being so patient and welcoming and doing all of this work to really make this conversation series happen. So these are two buildings. On the left, you see the Braddock Carnegie Library, which was built in 1889, and the Carnegie Museum of Art, which was established in 1895. Each of these buildings were built and conceived of by Andrew Carnegie. And I guess I should specify that on the right, the museum that you see, that is the SCAIF. It was an addition, obviously. It was not built in 1895. But both of these buildings were conceived by Andrew Carnegie with kind of the value system of this benevolence, of Western philanthropy, the value system of mind, body, and spirit as this kind of knowledge that's inherent to a human and a right for a human. And in that, Carnegie named that, and he named also that these places are for the public. What I think is so important to also name is that who that public was and who was deserving of the knowledge and who had access to being able to use these resources for the betterment of their mind, body, and spirit also had restrictions. He had very clear, you know, and I think implicit ways that that public was defined. And that's one of the things that I think is present both in Gamynne's work and my work, is this constant questioning of who is the public and how do we become very explicit about what we mean with the public, because oftentimes the public becomes a tool for erasure. So with these two buildings, we think about how do we continue to make the choices that both carry the legacy forward of, like, these buildings were, in this idea of museums and libraries were built with reason, but really think about how the contents and the everyday choices that are happening, both organizationally, the structure, how things are being chosen, how things are being designed, how that actually transforms the history of the buildings. So I see these two institutions as forms, and the social and economic histories and the context and conditions that made them and that are in relation to them are present in the buildings themselves. So I guess what I want to say here also is that I worked at the Braddock Carnegie Library Association for 12 years. I started out as an artist collaborative called Transformasium, and that began our work there. And then I became the associate director. And I now currently, as of the end of January, am working at the Carnegie Museum of Art. So what you're also going to see is kind of a transition for myself in terms of my institutional relationship to both of these things. So next slide. So for this case study, I'm going to focus on the Art Lending Collection. The Art Lending Collection was developed in 2013. It's now 8 years old. In my collective Transformasium, the Carnegie International approached us to be artists, and we proposed the Art Lending Collection to them as a continuation of our work in the library. The Art Lending Collection allows artworks to be checked out by patrons. All they need is their Allegheny County Library card. There's over 200 pieces of artwork in the collection, and you can check out the work for 3 weeks with the option of renewal. The collection is made up of multiple collections, and a key part of the Art Lending Collection is that there are arts and culture facilitators who really create the connection between the artwork and the resources and the neighborhood. The Art Lending facilitators, sorry, did I say facilitators? I hope so. The Art Lending facilitators work on a co-learning model, each bringing knowledge and personal knowledge and relationships to the artworks to build the map of what the artwork is and where it comes from. Next slide, please. So for this, I just kind of want to offer that I think about art as a set of relationships between the artist, the artwork, and the world. And one of the things that you'll hear is kind of this, and that's practice, is how do we approach artwork with wonder and not knowing? And this methodology is really inspired by Rux Media Collective. There's a great essay they wrote in Curating an Educational Turn called Wonderful Uncertainty that I recommend if you haven't yet read it. Next slide, please. So these images are all pieces of the Art Lending Collection, just a sampling. As I said, there's over 200 pieces. Initially, the collections were created by asking various patrons of the Braddock Carnegie Library to create collections to think about for the Art Lending collections. And so these are patrons that already had a practice of art dialogue with the library. We also have a neighborhood print shop. We have an ongoing exhibition series. So the arts discourse was present in the library already. And the Art Lending collection is also really entrenched and based in the idea that art and culture exists in every single neighborhood, and that people are constantly making choices about the artworks and the aesthetics and the systems that they have around themselves. And so the Art Lending collection is truly a way to emphasize that. And so in one part of the library with the print shop, we're really talking about artistic production. And then the Art Lending collection kind of transitioned to us to think about who's making choices, how are collections formed, and how do we value artwork. So this slide I particularly love because you can kind of see 3 different collections here. So I'll go to the next slide. And These are some of the ways that the art lending collection is activated and utilized. This artwork on the right is very current. We brought the art lending collection outside during the pandemic to make sure that people could still check out artwork. You can go on. Again, like I said, the art lending facilitators have a really important role, because what they're doing is every single day, much like librarians, connecting the individual artworks to everyday needs, to community resources, and to the dialogue of current events in the neighborhood. They're also thinking about the ways that the art connects with the community. I think one of the things when we think about collections and community is also letting go control of how the collection works. And again, how does the artwork work in different contexts? So on your left, you see a Wade Guyton U stencil that's turned into a racetrack. And on your right, you see the artwork in a community bodega. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is how the art lending collection looked in the library. In the art museum at the Carnegie Museum of Art. During the Carnegie International, we had an ongoing rotation of artwork that was curated by residents of our library. Next slide, please. And again, another example of kind of what does it mean to think about different forms and different contexts. One of the things that was important about our installation is we wanted to bring the library into the art museum. And so a part of that for us was comfort. So you'll see here that that comfort was much needed within the museum. Next slide, please. So I think I just wanted to wrap up with these last few slides that, we started with the art lending collection, but then we realized we had this whole other collection around us, which was the book lending collection. So we'd applied the same methodology of how we built the art lending collection to the books in the library. So we had various library patrons and regional residents come and look at our collection and identify what was missing. And then we acquired those books. So the texts on paper here were books we didn't have, but this was a collection that Kalolo Luckett pulled together. And she is actually one of the next speakers at the next piece of the series. Next slide, please. So these are also kind of extended collections that got created by patrons. You can keep going to the last slide in interest of time. Thank you. So finally, I wanted to kind of end this. This is a text that a collaborator, Dustin Gibson, and I wrote with Becca Zela Mnguni about disability justice and building a collection for disability justice in the library. And this, to me, really embodies a lot of thinking about collections. So I wanted to just kind of read this really briefly, a paragraph from that piece. So this is about building a collection for disability justice. And this was bringing together multiple books from different sections in the library to form one collection. Our decision to not permanently separate out and codify this specific collection of books and films honors their multiform relationships while acknowledging the ways they are currently stratified by the existing system of categorization within the library. The collecting of the individual books and films from their mostly disparate locations within the library can be experienced as a gathering of the complexities of ourselves. As an example, otherwise categorized into separate sections of a library, a subjective choice to place the Cancer Journals by Audre Lorde next to Black Disabled Art History 101 compels a relationship between the two, creating an opportunity for an expanded understanding of their interdependence, their differences, and where each of us can enter. And so finally, I think a collection is a way to really think about something that's not still, and I'm excited to talk about that more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, Dana and Gamynne. These were excellent and really engaging case studies, and I think the connections are so strong, and there's so much to unpack here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I note that there's some Q&As that might be short answers if folks want to, if the panelists want to take a look at that. But I'm going to also be pulling from some of the Q&A. So also for the audience, please feel free to keep adding additional questions. So because our topic today is transforming collections and connecting with communities, I really want us to start as we stitch together these examples and learn from each other here. How these concepts of collections and communities, transformation and connection operate in these examples. And so from my view, in each of these case studies, there's alternative models that are tied to these much larger institutions that each, and there's sort of three actually, right, of these larger institutions that have very different relationships to the communities. So, for both the BMA and the CMOA, as was mentioned, there are these large encyclopedic or demi-encyclopedic collecting institutions with over 100, that have been around for over 100 years, and the cities in which they're located have changed so dramatically in that time. And I think in the Lexington Market and the Braddock Art Lending Collection, we can see alternative collecting and display practices, right? So Gamynne, you mentioned, having fine art from the permanent collection of the museum, literally on the same plane with, things being made in the space. Or we can think, Dana, about just the shiver that went down my spine seeing artworks outside. Like there's, even in reproduction, there are ways that we're seeing these received wisdoms challenged. But I also think that there's something about making it public and participatory that actually helps demystify what the museum itself is. And I'm wondering, if in terms of how these projects develop new modes of making, looking, and valuing art, if it's really because they put community first. And often when we talk about institutions serving a community or the community, it's this sort of monolithic, assumed thing. And I think, Dana, you brought this up by saying, who is the public and who is excluded in the process of naming the public? And so I'm really wondering, with these examples that are already thinking, steeped in this thought and really trying to work against it, I'm wondering if you could each speak to the ways that communities were and were not formed in these projects, and how collections maybe mediated that. So was there a way that when people came together in new ways, the objects changed or vice versa? Gamynne, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. That is such an interesting and rich question, Rebecca. So in general, my thinking and the thinking of my department around publics is that they are multiple and various. We very intentionally name publics plural when we think about who we are in community with and in conversation with. We very intentionally work against the server-served model. So we do not serve community because community is not waiting for us to come and do anything. We don't operate from a model of lack, where there is a notion that there is a service that is not already extant within the community. So we're coming, I think, to our various publics with a sense of sort of deep collaboration and co-creation, which is why projects like this are very hard to talk about and sell in a lot of ways. They're hard to talk about until you've made them, right? Because you have to make them with the other people, the other constituents involved. So there is, I think, almost a social sculpture aspect, right, to what we do and how we think about it. So the various publics that get mobilized around, and I do want us to think about publics as something that are project driven. So the idea of how a project mobilizes a public, how that public comes together, and how that project holds that public, and vice versa. And then that having a timeline and a lifespan often associated with it as well, as something that is very much, I think, a part of our practice. So the various publics around the Outpost project and BMA Lexington Market have shifted and grown over time. It has been, in many cases, I think, a radical collision of our existing audiences with the audiences to be found at Lexington Market. I think that there's been a conversation around what constitutes a legitimate interaction with museum space. It's something we talk about a lot. And we see Lexington Market as a visit to the BMA. We count it as a visit to the BMA. So understanding how those spaces operate relative to each other, I think, is important. How objects have mediated, in terms of creating and mobilizing those public. I almost think of this as more as a total artwork. So while the reproductions of collection objects are important, and sometimes they drive that conversation, very often, the temporary exhibition that happens in the space drives that conversation, or a particular performance drives that conversation, or just the spatial dynamics drive that conversation. So I think it's actually about how all of those things begin to come together and inform and interrelate to each other. And I think that with going on sort of year 2 of this in the market and going on year 7 of being in community in this way, we're starting to see within the institution some of those shifts beginning to happen around curatorial practice as our curators get a little bit more excited about how they can be involved in thinking through collections in these spaces. So I think that in our next iteration, when we're out of COVID times, you're going to be seeing a lot of moving image. You're going to be coming out of collection, and you're going to be seeing a lot of conversations around the reproductions coming out of collection making community.
I'm wondering also, as you think about the answer to my long-winded question, to also tie in some of the Q&A questions here. So Alex Taylor asked, if there are lessons that come out of these projects that are about also bringing museums back into sort of, we might imagine, the hub or the primary site. And also, another question that is posed here is, how could we imagine, from Maggie Shaheen, if this sort of model of a breakout of a traditional institution, how that might work in a place like Pittsburgh, and if the Braddock Library in some ways attempted that, and those lessons too.
Great, thank you. I think one of the things, Gamynne spoke about co-creation, and also to the fact that different publics assemble around different moments, and that the space itself is transformed by the people that assemble there. And I think one of the things that, it feels so important to me, like, especially with the Art Lending collection, it's not like we were bringing art to a community. The art existed in the community. The collection was generated by the community, right? So I think when Gamynne said, trying to get away from served and server, it's just like where we have these slips to assume where the art already exists, where it doesn't exist, who was bringing it, who was speaking it, how is art made? All of these questions, they sound so basic, and sometimes when we ask them, but they're the kind of questions that almost have to become a mantra, because to break down and deconstruct the kind of value system that's created around art and how we see art, I think has to be a constant, right? Because we're constantly unlearning that. So one of the things about the Art Lending collection is that it started out as an artist project, but in the MOU with the library, it said that this project can exist for 3 years. And then after that, the community of users need to decide how it will continue to exist. So now it has become something that's stewarded by the community. The collection grows based on the community. The collection is utilized. Sometimes the Art Lending collection is not very active at all. Sometimes it's hugely active. And I think this also really creates kind of questions around, I'm also giving a long-winded answer to your question, Becca, and all of these questions, but I just really wanted to kind of position, we need to think about how we're seeing the movement of this work, right? And how we're seeing the movement of communities. And then I also think that we also have to reconsider what we're calling success. To me, this work is about challenging our value systems. And so often institutions kind of are so connected through funding metrics, through all of these things, through history about how we're valuing the success of work and projects. And I think that when we push a little bit, we can really start to rethink what success looks like and kind of, again, how those value systems are built. And I love something that Gamynne said that I want to kind of uplift again is, Gamynne said something about the project is it cannot be fully institutionalized. And I think that also becomes a really important tension when we think about the relationship of these projects. So to kind of respond to Can, you know, like we need to have more outposts like of museums. How does that look? Like, what does it look like to extend that? I think that we need multiple strategies because, you know, there are so many different kinds of living museums in different neighborhoods already. But how are we valuing those spaces? How are we funding those spaces? And then institutions like the Carnegie Museum of Art and the Baltimore Museum of Art have access to resources and a history of accessing resources and a language to access those particular resources. And so there can be practices of redistribution and there can be different kinds of relationships. And I think what's really apparent and important about both projects is the slowness. Like it doesn't just happen overnight. So that would be like another thing that I would add to this.
Thank you both for those, I think, really instructive answers. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing is that, you know, I think Gamynne said, there's no formula, right? And I think that's part of what makes this work so hard, is that we have to both do the unlearning that you're talking about, Dana, and revamp the value system with which we were all inculcated with and are actively inculcated with in most visits to the museum. And there's no formula. And I think that is what makes for sort of the authentic change that's possible, which also includes acknowledging the histories of exclusion, which rarely happens, I think, when there's this sort of, we go out into this sort of art desert we might think about, rather than seeing all the ways that both of these projects have pointed out that there are incredible assets, cultural assets, and different ways of knowing and valuing art, which is not about a disinterest in fine art or in the museum. There's often a very deep love and familiarity with these institutions. But as we're thinking about these multiple strategies, I'm wondering if there's a way of thinking about the mechanics of these things that are worth giving just a little bit of attention to, particularly in terms of duration. And I love, Dana, this question that baked into the project was that the community gets to decide what happens next after this initial phase. And Gamynne, I note that there's sort of 2 phases to these BMA projects. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to the ways that you have each thought about the obligations and ethics as we begin to promote this idea of sort of outreach or perhaps even reparative work on the part of institutions. Does anyone want to take that?
I can speak quickly to one thing that we did in the mechanics that I feel like is really important. A lot of people have kind of, since the initiation of the Art Lending Collection, called and asked us like, how do we start one? And they exist as a form in the world. But one of the things we say, it's less about the Art Lending Collection, and to echo Gamynne again, it's about how you think about staffing it and what you're valuing in terms of staffing. So our major cost for the Art Lending Collection was creating 3 new positions in our library for the art lending facilitators. The art lending facilitator's job description is really the fiber of the entire project. And so we had to convince foundations that creating this new position, right? And that's one of the hardest things to do, is to create new positions, was key and integral to the project. And what's incredible about that is that now that is more identified as a cultural role, right? And so I think one of the things that we can do is start to build these languages around what's actually necessary for community work is a lot of resources and a lot of jobs. So that's a mechanic I wanted to speak to.
I'll speak this in 2 ways, both in the macro and then with a very, very specific example. Yeah, I think that, you know, duration is something that we think a lot about in terms of what happens with community beyond the life of the project, right? So even within a 1-month engagement or within a 3-month engagement, there's a lot of conversation around how those relationships get managed when the outpost left and came to another site. And what we've seen over the past 6-7 years or so is that we've really built a community of engagement around the project through former and current sites who still are invested in and interested in the museum in different ways. And so you start to see this really interesting slippage in roles where someone who may have found us through an outpost site and came every day and loved making art may have given an artist talk at the BMA through our Open Hours program, which is a community-based programming program. And that same person then may also have, helped us out with our summative evaluation for another program. And so what we're seeing are these multiple pathways to engagement, which is something that's super, super interesting. And how we maintain those relationships over time is something that begins to infuse, and this is how you get this back to the mothership. I know there was a question around how does the work feed back into the hub. This is how we're starting to see it bleed back into day-to-day museum practice in really interesting and unusual ways. And then a very specific example that I will say is that we noticed that in each of these outpost sites, we would get 1 or 2 people who are like super users. And they'd come every day and they'd become ambassadors for the space. And we all got to know that happens, right? These community projects. So why don't we pay those people? Why don't we actually have community liaisons who we actually pay to do the actual labor that we're asking them to do? So this is what we started writing in to sort of each of those budgets for those outpost sites, but really understanding that if we're going to do the work with community, then we need to be together as cultural workers in community.
Right, and Gamynne, I love the way that you're tying this explicitly to labor, because I think this is the undercurrent of all of this, right? Is that it takes money, and that is the currency we have to demonstrate value and to pay people to create the time in their lives to share their knowledge, right? And which actually leads me, because we're sadly running out of time, to my last question. I know there's some great ones still, and I hope you'll reach out to Dana and Gamynne for your questions. But this is a kickoff for a museum studies major, right? And it's a fascinating thing, a museum studies major. And one of the things that I was thinking about, and I'm so excited to hear from you both about, is that you have backgrounds as makers, artists, designers, these other ways of also thinking about objects in a way that also I'm hearing you both say, part of the problem is how we've been taught to think about objects. So I'm wondering if you could share with our students any reflections you have about, how bridging these different roles or expertises that you already held maybe shaped or didn't shape your approach to museum work. And maybe Dana, will start with you and then hear from Gamynne.
Okay. I never expected to work in an art museum. But I am really interested in systems change and how we think about constructions and learning, and how we think about gathering together, and how we think about how institutions are formed, and how to both live with complex histories and live in the complexity of it and create from it. And I would say that I think I'm right in the middle of my transition from the library to the museum. So I'm really grappling with what that means. And I'm so honored that really the museum was able to see, really the director at Crosby was able to recognize that the work and methodologies that I was working on with my collaborators was something that could translate into a museum. So I think that goes back to, how do these things get internalized by a museum, is recognizing that our community practices also are in conversation, right? They don't exist in isolation. They are in conversation. And I think it's our art institutions' kind of obligation to recognize that they're impoverished without the voices of our neighborhoods, right? And I'll just say quickly before that, another thing is we started at the library. Also, I didn't expect to work at a library, but our project started with the print shop in the library, and then slowly I grew into an administrator at the library. So that's my path.
Thank you for the question. My path, it's such a strange path. It makes sense now in retrospect, and while I was going through it, absolutely made no sense whatsoever. I will say, because we are sort of talking about young practitioners coming into the field, I had absolutely no idea what my next job would be at any point in my career. All I knew to do was leverage whatever I did next to do something else that interested me. And so I started out in the world of galleries and Kunsthalle style museums. I moved away from that to do a degree in architecture, because as much as I loved advocating for artists and architects, I was really missing making. and the importance of making, and the kind of making that I wanted to make with space. And so coming into architecture school, I thought a lot about buildings as objects. I thought a lot about architecture as about making and materiality. And coming out of architecture school, I came out of it with an understanding of architecture as the social relationships of people in spaces over time, and that being sort of what one is making. So, and then came back into museums through museum interpretation, which was a field that didn't exist when I was in undergrad. And so in a field that held a lot of my interest in space, technology, art, and people. And it grew from there. So I think that what I bring to my role, I am not a museum educator by training. I'm not an educator at all by training, which is very interesting, running an education department. But what I bring to it is I think, design thinking. I come to it as a designer. So I come to it with a deep sense of collaboration, a deep sense of iterative thinking, a deep sense of systems thinking. And all of that, I think, has been enormously important in the work. And I come to it as somebody who understands that spaces construct subjects, and that the kinds of spaces that we put our bodies in, there are certain affordances and constraints to those spaces. And the space of the museum is a very particular kind of space. And so that if we want to think about how we shape our social relationships, we have to think about the pressures that those spaces put on those bodies. So I think that's what I bring to it.
That's wonderful. Thank you both so much for this conversation. I think it's been really eye-opening also to sort of on the inside go through this process of also discussing these things in advance so that we could present, I think, a coherent and cogent one. And I really appreciate your candor and curiosity. I also want to say, I'm going to share my screen just one last time to remind folks to sign up for the next Turning Point event, which will be April 15th with a focus on curatorship with Kololo Luckett, director of the Alma Lewis in Pittsburgh, and Ryan Dennis from the Mississippi Museum of Art. And so we also encourage folks to complete the post-event survey, which you'll be receiving in your email. And Sylvia is going to put the link to the Eventbrite to sign up for the next one in the chat. Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Has been a delight.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for having us. So many wonderful questions in the chat. We can just keep talking.
Yeah.
Thank you all. I know that we're filtering out of the room, but we have so many of the questions that went unanswered. I wanted to just say thank you. Thank you for all of your participation in that wonderful conversation. So I will actually, if you don't mind, screenshot the questions if we want to follow up or if you find any particularly interesting. I thought there were a lot of really interesting questions coming in. So I'll just screenshot them and kind of send them to you all with everything in return. But my gosh, thank you. You made me think about my collection so much more. So, and just how that operates. I think people are still filtering out. So go ahead.
A question in the chat from Teresa Bauman, who wants to know if there's a good way to follow up. I assume she means contacting Gamynne or Dana. I don't know if y'all want to put your institutional emails.
Yeah, it's fine.
Bauman. Oh yeah, I see it. Yep. And we have some of our students too. Better have some questions. I thought, Christina Hansen is our student who's
talking. Yeah, I can connect Christina and Gamynne.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Gamynne and Dana, if you have a couple of these, I think there aren't too many, but it would be lovely for people to have that kind of follow-up, for sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we weren't able to get it all.
No, it went by very quickly. Oh my gosh, that hour went.
It's a big conversation. There's a lot to talk about, and a lot of great thought-provoking questions too in the chat. So happy to follow up. It may take me a little while, and I'm out of town next week. So, but I'm
enjoy out of town. But if there are questions that come from this conversation for either of you or any three of you in terms of like, what does this spur for your thinking, or where would you go with the next question? Please let me know, and we can think about how to follow up. Like, will it be in some sort of, you know, maybe social media or another part 2, or how will we, because we will continue this series, I do hope, in the future. So I will write to you separately because I think we should let everybody go at this point. So thank you all very, very much. It was so great. I hope to meet you IRL sometime.
Yes.
Well, Dana,
come and I can show you the museum when we're back in the real world again.
I love it.
Love that.
And same for you. When you come up to Pittsburgh, you've got all of us to kind of guide you around. So
fabulous. I love the town. It's a rockin' town. So I'm always welcome to Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and between Dana and I, we could find the good hidden places to go for sure too. That's what we want to show you for sure.
Excellent.
Right. Thank you all. Have a good day. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.